said that a virus or a disease doesn't really discriminate on who it is going to hit. It is often said that they don't discriminate, that an infection doesn't discriminate on whether you're rich or poor, whether you're fair or dark, whether what your caste, religion or race background is. And of course, that is true. But when it comes to a long-term impact of a 2-year-long pandemic, things are extremely different. And that is what we are going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how COVID and after COVID, subsequently the kind of inflation and war concerns that we're looking at is impacting different segments of the world, different segments of the society in an extremely different fashion, and why it is so concerning. So at a time actually when the richest of the rich are gathering together in Davos to discuss the world's economy, to discuss the world's future, Oxfam International has released a report that really shows the growing inequalities of the world, that shows about how millions of people across the world are on the verge of being pushed towards extreme poverty, even as the rich get richer. And in this edition of Simplified, we're going to talk about that. Let me first take you through some of very interesting statistics, scary, extremely concerning, jarring numbers and comparisons that have been mentioned in this report. On your screens, a billionaire is created every 30 hours since the pandemic started in this world. Every 30 hours, one person becomes a billionaire. But if you compare it to what this report says will happen to the rest of the world in this year, they say in every 33 hours, 1 million people could be pushed towards extreme poverty. Look at the difference, the stark difference between the two. So on one hand, the wealth of billionaires of this world increased more in 2 years, the last 2 years of the pandemic, than it did in all of the 23 years before that. Can you imagine that difference? On the other hand, we are actually talking about the fact that over 200 million people could be pushed towards extreme poverty just this year. These are some of the very, very jarring statistics that give you a sense of the gap, the growing gap between the rich and the poor in this country. The total wealth of billionaires is about almost 14% of the global GDP in this world. But on the other hand, 60% of the low-income countries are literally on the brink of a debt distress. Countries like Sri Lanka have already begun to go through massive emergency crisis. So who is really getting richer? Let me just tell you a little bit more about that before we then break it down for you with our expert who's joining us. Who is getting richer? Well, according to this report, if you look at the wealth of the 10 of the richest people in this world, 10 of the richest people in this world, they are more wealthy than 40% of the bottom of this world. 10 people and 40%. That's how badly, in an unequal manner, the wealth is distributed in this world. Amongst the sectors, there is energy sector, there is the food sector, agriculture and food processing, and then there is the pharmaceutical sector, obviously in times of a pandemic, that has seen lot more people turn into billionaires, and those who were already billionaires get richer and richer. For example, 40 new pharma billionaires have come into the list since the pandemic began. The fortunes of energy billionaires are rising by $1 billion every 2 days. $1 billion, an amount unimaginable for a majority of this world and even in our country itself. Again, that's the disparity. So today we're going to talk about why this disparity. Let me say hello and welcome to Anjela Taneja, Inequality Campaign Lead for Oxfam in India. Thank you so much, Ms. Taneja, for joining us. I want to start off by really asking you, while the report highlights these statistics that helps us paint a larger picture, can you give us some specific examples to explain this extreme difference?
I guess I guess the figures speak for themselves in terms of at a time when over the last 2 years people have lost jobs, people have had to, we've had instances of extreme hunger. We've had experiences of schools being closed for 2 years for face-to-face instruction. At the same time, we've also had across the world, it's not just India, also had the growth in extreme wealth. So therefore, at this time of crisis, we've not had what one would have wished for, a sense of one India, of the rich and the poor coming together to face a common crisis. But we've had unequal experience of the pandemic, and the risk is that it would also contribute towards unequal recovery unless something is done at this stage.
Why is it happening? And like you spoke about India, the report talks about rest of the world as well. The richer countries are getting richer, the poorer are really bearing the brunt of it, and this is something that many were warning us as we got into a pandemic with a series of lockdowns and slowdowns that came about, loss of jobs. But to your mind, why are we seeing it take place at such an extreme level?
I guess in a lot of ways it's political will, be it in the global north or the global south. There is an inadequate attention to the fact that this is something that's fixable. Even if some countries, again, that have taken steps, a significant number of countries may not have done so, but a few countries have stepped in to deal with some of those consequences of extreme inequality. So therefore, it would be critical for India to also learn from some of those experiences. Why are things the way they are? Because we have allowed them to stay there that way.
We've allowed them to stay that way. Let me speak about some of the information that was also put out in the India-specific report some time back, which said that 84% of the households suffered from decline in income during the pandemic. 84% of the households in the country suffered from a decline in the money that they were earning and the income that they were getting during COVID time. But the number of billionaires actually grew from 102 to 142 in the same period. So just like what we're seeing at a larger world stage, it's also getting reflected in the India story. The wealth of billionaires increased from 23.14 lakh crore rupees to more than double of that, to 53.16 lakh crore rupees. That's how rich the rich got. On the other hand, 4.6 crore Indians fell into extreme poverty. Now, when we say, fell into extreme poverty, or this year more people are expected to be pushed towards poverty, Ms. Taneja, how are you defining this extreme poverty? And I ask you this question because often when such reports are put out, it becomes a political conversation where many in power, governments and establishments in power say, well, we disagree with the definition of poverty, extreme poverty, or even the methodology. So what would you say to that?
One goes with the UN definition of what is extreme poverty, which is 1.9 dollars per day. Therefore, it's not that we are making up statistics. It's what the globally accepted UN standard is.
Okay, so you're saying this is the globally accepted UN standard. Then let's now get to the specifics of India. You said that there are several examples across the world where governments have tried to bridge this gap, or at least reduce this gap to some extent. But our government doesn't seem to have moved in that direction. What can the government do to fix this problem?
So I guess if the problem is unequal wealth, then the solution is also some degree of redistribution of wealth that is in the interest of the majority. So therefore, what we've been asking for and what the report is asking for more specifically is a taxation on the windfall profits that companies have made during the time of the pandemic, which Italy has, for example, has done this time. We are asking for at least one-time solidarity wealth tax on new billionaires that have come in. Again, in terms of an example, Argentina has introduced one last year, which to fund its COVID recovery plan. Uh, and we're asking for a long-term permanent wealth tax on the richest to make sure that we, as a nation, are able to raise revenues for the purposes for which which are essential at this point. Therefore, say COVID-19 vaccination should better be funded through a taxation on India's super rich rather than through fuel taxes, as has been happening until now. And this is a logic. B seems to make financial sense, and at the same time, it's also what pretty much every opinion survey of ordinary people, including middle class, have said is what would be preferable at this point in time.
So you're actually, and yes, you're right. That many have already, raised the chorus on this. That the wealthy and the rich, the companies that have been making profits, minting money really during the pandemic, and some of those sectors have been highlighted even in this report. They should be additionally taxed, but. We actually saw that in the first year of the pandemic, our government went and gave some tax relief to corporate India. Do you think that was one of the problems which perhaps even widened the gap in our country?
So one isn't against blanket subsidies to companies. What we have not done, however, is making sure that the relief goes to the sectors that need it the most, and not to those who can afford it. So therefore, there is time. It is time for surcharge on those who are making extra profits, and it's not just about the fact that we're not against the fact that the corporate sector might need help at this point in time. But
Okay.
if one is making, if someone's income is doubling or wealth is doubling at this point in time, maybe at that point something needs to be done.
Okay, let me then very quickly recap what you said and what are also the recommendations of by Oxfam in its the report that's just come out. That one, urgent excess profits tax on world's largest of the corporations. So the corporations, the giants, whether in energy sector or pharmaceutical sector or the food and agriculture sector or any other sector really, that have lots of money going about right now, should give an excess profits tax. One, our solidarity wealth tax on people who've just recently become billionaires, and a permanent wealth tax on the richest, examples of which Taneja gave. A few of the countries have tried. Now let's talk on the other side of what will the government and what should the government, for example in India, do with this money once they've taxed the rich? Where do you think it urgently needs to go? You gave one example that rather than a fuel tax, you tax the rich and then you use that money for COVID relief. But obviously beyond the COVID vaccine, a lot more now needs to be done for the lower 50% of this country. So where should the government focus with this money?
Protection. There has the poor has still not, families are still not recovered from the economic shocks of the last 2 years. The health system remains fairly weak and requires additional resources. Yes, we are focused on dealing with this particular pandemic, but the next one isn't going to be necessarily a respiratory disease. It could be something else. Fundamentally, we need a stronger public health system. I've worked on education for most of my life. Therefore, I would say education has been woefully neglected over the last 2 years, with the expectation that everyone should be able to move online for their education, which pretty much every experience that every research that has been undertaken shows majority of Indians have not been able to Indian children have not been able to access online education, at least not in a meaningful, long term, consistent way that's required for effective learning. So, therefore, focus on those in need, focus on those who are vulnerable, to folks spend the money on those who need the money and not allow it to just pile up with those who plain and simple don't need it.
Yeah, absolutely, completely agree with you. One other interesting, fact that I found in the report was that every minute, 4 children around the world lose a parent or a caregiver as a result of the pandemic, and this is a worldwide fact. But what was interesting to me was that almost half of these were in India. Over 2 million children who suffered a lost a parent during the pandemic. Now, a year ago, Ms. Taneja, there was a lot of conversation even from center, from various state governments with various associations to say how best we can take care of these children. Where have those efforts reached, and do you believe a lot more needs to be done in that segment?
Yes, a lot more definitely needs to be done. And not just for those who've lost parents, but also uh, larger social support systems around them as well. And it's the need to continue education, it's the health issues, it's everything else. And, for pretty much the whole of the country, we also have the psychological scars of 2 years of not feeling safe to go outside are not going to go away very soon.
All right, thank you so much for joining us, Anjela Taneja, and really sharing your views and insights into this report that's come out and breaking it down for our viewers to really understand what this report says and why it's such a big concern. Repeatedly, the statistics that we've actually put out highlight the increasing gap between the poor people, people who have lost income, people who've lost jobs, people who are struggling right now across the world to really even buy food, to get their basic essentials, to send their children to school, to even have a home. And on the other side, you have people who are making more and more money, billionaires who are getting richer by the day. I want to give you 2 interesting examples as we wrap this up. From this report again, it will take 112 years of work, 112 years of work for a worker in the bottom 50% to earn what the top 1% gets in just 1 year. In just 1 year. There's another example. Since Elon Musk is so much in conversation these days, the report actually goes on to highlight that Elon Musk could lose 99% of his wealth and he would still be in the 0.0001% of the world's richest people. That's the gap between the rich and the poor. Often we talk about K-shaped recovery. This is essentially a result of that kind of a K-shaped recovery. What is really K-shaped recovery? That essentially means that when an economy is coming out of a recession kind of a situation or even an extreme slowdown and it then begins to show some improvement, the improvement is not uniform. It's actually shaped like a K, where one segment goes up and up and up and shows great recovery, but there is another section which continues to still decline. Now, this K-shaped recovery could be for between various kinds of sectors, between industry and agriculture and services. It could also be in various segments of society, so the rich and the poor. And one of the biggest impacts that we actually see is the K-shaped recovery between the wealth distribution in a society. So the poor are getting poor getting poorer, and the rich simply minting more money. This report calls for action from governments to try and bridge this gap. It now remains to be seen how many governments across the world, or those rich entities currently sitting in Davos and discussing the world economy, actually how many of them take a look at this and do something about it. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Simplified.